Hey, I'm Steve. Thanks for joining me today. Today I want to talk about how you can stay close to God even when you are far away from friends. This is an unusual time in our society's life as we deal with the coronavirus. Many of us around the country and around the world have been ordered to shelter in place, and this has meant for many of us an isolation from our friends and our families. And the question comes up, how do you remain spiritually and emotionally healthy in a season like this? Now, fortunately, the Bible has a lot to say on this theme. Throughout human history, there have been many times when God's people have been cut off from their families or cut off from their entire nations as refugees. And in that experience, God has not abandoned his people. One of the great examples of this theme in the Bible comes from Psalm 42. It was written by one of the sons of Korah. Now, these were the worship leaders in the temple in Jerusalem. They were the ones in charge of gathering all the people together and having this great celebration of God and doing it together as a great community. But in this psalm, Psalm 42, the author says that he is north of Israel, far away from Jerusalem and from the temple. For some reason, he's in exile, far away from his people. And the experience for him is just devastating. He is completely torn up about this isolation from his family. He says in the psalm that he's like a deer panting for water, like a deer in a season of drought that is looking around trying to find refreshment from a riverbed but can't because all the rivers are dry. So this guy is saying, I'm looking around for my community and I'm looking around to experience joy and life with God. And yet all I find is a spiritual drought and depression. Now, because of his experience, the author of the psalm is actually really helpful in giving us a few guidelines for how to draw near to God, even in a time of isolation and separation from friends and family. The first thing that we learn from the psalm is that you have to acknowledge the pain and emotional turmoil that you're going through in a season of isolation. So the author says that he is experiencing physical symptoms of depression. He says, my tears are my food day and night. And what he means by that is I'm weeping all the time. I'm not sleeping because I'm up all night weeping, and I'm not eating either. Instead of ingesting food to keep me going, all I have are my tears. And then there's also like the social aspect of his pain. Apparently he has some enemies, and these people are criticizing him. And whatever the background or story is there are people around him making the situation even worse through their hostility. And so for him, the whole experience then adds up to this feeling of being cut off from God. He uses the imagery of the ocean. He says, deep cries out to deep. It's as if waves are crashing over me and I'm getting pounded by the surf. Man, I just feel completely hammered and cut off from God. Now, in saying all this, he's actually doing the first step toward spiritual and emotional healing. He is unloading and being honest about the fact that he's a man in pain, that cut off from that sweet worship with God and all of God's people at the temple, he's hurting. And once he does that, he's ready to do the next thing. The second thing that we learn from this psalm is that the author is really good at rehearsing and remembering the kindness and goodness and promises of God. The great Welsh preacher, D.M. Lloyd Jones, put it this way in his book, Spiritual Depression. He says that rather than letting yourself speak to you, you have to speak to yourself. Rather than letting your tears and your emotional sorrow speak to you and overwhelm what you know to be true, instead you have to speak to your pain. You have to speak the truth of God to your pain in order to remember that God is actually the one who has done a set of things in history, and that he really is going to take care of you in every season of suffering and isolation and sorrow. And so over and over again, the author of this psalm says, why are you so downcast, O my soul? Hope yet in God. For my salvation is in seeing God's face. When I look to God, I remember, oh yeah, I really am safe because of the future that he is providing for me. When I was in college, I was on the cross country and track team, and I loved to run. I loved to contribute to the team. And for a short while, I was a pretty decent runner and running on the varsity team and helping the team get better. But at the end of my freshman year, I got a stress fracture in my right ankle. And then as soon as I had rehabbed from that and built my mileage up again, I got a stress fracture in my left shin. And before you knew it, it became pretty clear that my running career, at least my competitive running career, was pretty much over. I just couldn't run as far or as fast as I had in the past. And my sense of belonging, frankly, in the running community began to fade away because I could no longer do the things that a collegiate runner needed to do. That was a difficult time in my life when a key part of my identity was taken away. And yet in that season, I found these truths from Psalm 42 to be extremely helpful to me. I named my pain before God. I acknowledged that it really sucked that I couldn't run as far and as fast as I wanted to anymore, and that I wasn't going to set any more personal records. I journaled about it. I was honest with friends about it. I poured out the fact to God that I was really hurting. And then secondly, I acknowledged before God that his promises were in fact better and deeper than anything that could ever come from running. For as great as running is, the best that I could have hoped for is maybe to win a handful of races or a few medals along the way. But I realized and I remembered, and frankly I knew all along, that God has made a set of infinite promises to every person who comes to him. Promises of belonging and of forgiveness and of an eternal existence and relationship with him, and not just infinite in the amount of time that you get to spend with God, but also of a quality of matchless and priceless worth. Christianity makes the claim that God's own life, his own joy, his own peace, his own generosity, all of the virtues that God himself has in his own life can be yours. They can be transferred into your own heart. And so I rehearsed those things and I remembered that God had made those promises to me. He has not promised us that we won't face isolation and the loss of relationships and the breakdown of community that can and does and will happen in this life. And I was not immune to it, and neither will you be. We will face losses of dear relationships in this life. And yet what I found in that season of my life is what so many other Christians have found throughout the ages, which is that as you open up your heart to God in prayer, after rehearsing his promises to yourself, he really does fill you with his life. It really is possible to stay close to God, even if you are cut off from friends. So in this season, my encouragement to you is to take up the guidance of Psalm 42. If you're going a little bit stir crazy in your house right now as you shelter in place, or if there are other relationships that you just wish were closer and more intimate, hopefully we all get there in a few weeks or a month's time to be reunited to all those relationships. But in the meantime, take this season as an opportunity to draw near to the Lord, who wants to draw near to you and fill you with his life.